Okay, now in this video, I'm going to shade the box that I drew in the earlier video. Now there was one part where I neglected to do a little bit of the line, and it's right here on this inner portion of that opening, and that's actually the cellophane inside the tissue box. All right. So people often ask about drawing things that are see-through. It can be kind of confusing. Really, the secret to drawing anything is to simply draw what you see. So you'll notice in this, because you can't see the tissue box that's sitting in front of me, that I'm using this reference photo so you can see the whole time what I'm drawing. So with this, I'm just finding the edge of this cellophane and I'm trying to copy that. So I might do that as something like this. So I'm seeing it down here, then kind of angling out like so, and then part of the cellophane coming up in front of that. And it just looks kind of squiggly, and that's fine. I can show a couple of these interior parts of the cellophane. So this line, this edge is in front of that back line, all right, because there's part of it kind of bubbling up. All right, and then another one here. All right, and if I don't get that perfect, it's no big deal because again, no one knows exactly what that cellophane looked like except for me. But I want to try to get it as close as I can because that's going to, the process of observing it will make it look real even if I didn't get it exactly right. All right, so that's what it's all about. It's about that attempt at observation. Whether you get it exactly perfect or not is almost less important than the process of doing it. Okay, now notice I didn't do all of these other background lines, and that's intentional because I want to keep this background simpler. So we're going to focus on the overall value. If I could, I would use some kind of blur technique to blur this background out. But since I don't have that technology readily available, I'm just going to kind of imagine. All right, so I can start wherever I want. The whole idea here is I'm going to compare the value. So I'm comparing along this edge, and we're going to start at edges. I'm just looking to see, is this side, when I'm looking at this edge, is this top plane lighter or darker? So along this edge, and notice the value changes. So here it's light and it gets a little bit darker, but always this side of the line is a little bit darker than this side of the line. All right, so as I follow that along, that's kind of a constant. Okay, so I don't have to make this side a constant shade of gray, but I am going to start with that side of the line. Okay, so I am using a darker pencil, and at this point in your shading, that probably makes sense. You want to start using some of the darker pencils in your kit. So in my case, I'm using an ebony. All right, so I start at that edge. I'm always starting at the edge and working away from the edge. Now, one thing that might seem counterintuitive, I did this whole thing to make this edge really, really perfect. Now I'm actually going to make the edge of this just a little bit less perfect because edges of cardboard are a little bit less perfect. I could also even draw in this extra little line. All right, and I can go ahead and I can shade that because that's even darker. All right, so I'm looking at those details even as I'm adding shading. Okay, so now how do I deal with that? Well, this is darker and I want to make sure that along this edge it's lighter than this is because, again, up here, this, even though it's darker than that, is lighter than that. All right, so I can actually use a gradation. Now I could also make this a little bit darker, but I could also just let that fade completely to white. So I can absolutely exaggerate. So I'm basing what I'm doing on what I'm seeing, but I'm also exaggerating. So often people will ask an artist, well, how do they know what to draw? A lot of it is looking. You don't have to work so hard to make things up if you base a lot of what you're doing on exactly what you see. So notice how I'm moving, inching along this edge. I'm always keeping these marks. They go in one direction and they're very small. They're about 1/2 inch in length. And because I want a smooth blended look, I'm not making separate hatching marks, although I could. All right, and I'm crawling along this box. Okay. Now again, when I get to this edge, look how that is not truly perfect right here. So again, I'm actually going to want to modify this and make it feel just a little bit less precise. And I'm going to add that little extra kind of flap where the cardboard meets over there. All right, and even down here, I want to see how that comes behind that very edge of the box. All right, so a lot of drawing is just observing very, very closely and understanding the relationships of different forms. So if one thing comes in front of another, like that front part of the cardboard goes in front of this side part of the cardboard, then this is going to appear in front so that this line will stop where it meets the line of the part that's in front. Okay, all right, so now once I've gotten that in there, I'm going to keep shading up until that edge. And then again, I'm going to shade this dark because I see this thing that is behind the front plane as darker than that plane next to it, which again makes sense because we've talked before in class about how generally speaking the thing that is behind will appear a little bit darker. Usually. Not always, but that's a way to make something appear behind as well, if they're actually of a similar value, is to make the thing that should be behind a little bit darker. All right, and again, I don't have to keep this the same constant value, so I can use a gradation as I get up to that edge. Now, if I do want to shade right up to that edge, here I am switching directions, so I'm going vertical. Okay. But I'm keeping it very light or even going all the way to white. All right, now you don't have to get all of this perfect right away. All right, now I am going to look at sort of this overall picture. Okay, so this is mostly going to be of a similar value on this front plane. So I was using my other pencil here, which just has a more precise tip, to get some of those edges where I wanted more precision. So it's really important to keep sharpening your pencils, and if the tip for this pencil just doesn't get as sharp, so that's why I often change pencils at the edge there. Now notice I don't have to go super, super slow, but I also can't speed along too fast because I have to make sure that these, my shading doesn't get sloppy. And notice how I might let it get a little bit lighter in the center just to keep it a little bit more interesting. Oh, and again, at this edge, we don't want it to be quite as dark because this behind it has a darker edge. All right, and then one way to handle that edge so it doesn't look like we've cut off the shading all of a sudden is to blend a little bit. Now I never want to blend. Now I've just made my tortillon, all right? I don't want to blend like this over that line. I want to keep my blending inside this plane, all right? Unless if it's a face or something where you want the edge of a nose to not be as precise in some places because it's not a really precise kind of crisp edge, then it might be different. But with something like this where these are very distinct, you want to make sure that you don't blend across that edge. All right, and I can even, if I want to brighten up the contrast, I can even make this side of the line a little bit lighter. Now I'm not erasing over here where it's darker, but I'm just using my eraser and then my pencil again to make that contrast a little bit crisper. And notice I might go back and forth until I get exactly what I want there. Okay. Notice here, if I have a couple of different edges going, I need to make sure that I'm kind of picking one. All right, so now I'm not trying to make this edge a really strong outline, but I am trying to make it clear. I want to make it very precise where that edge ends, but then I'm shading right next to it. And here I'm just making sure that I've extended that part of this flap as far down as it's going to go. And notice here, if I were going to give numbers to these values, I've got my darkest value. So say a 1, if the 1 is the dark end of the value scale, the low key. It's going to be close to a 1 along these two edges, but I do let it get lighter in the center. So you don't have to do it that way, but that's one way to keep some variety in your shading and to still give you the contrast where you want it. And notice again, I haven't necessarily shaded right up to this edge because I want to create a little bit of contrast, but I don't want it too abrupt an ending. Now again, if I want to make this more precise though, I can go back and use my eraser and make that edge nice and precise. And then I'm still trying to achieve kind of a blend between that white part and the shading. Okay, and now to make the rest of this box match, because I've used the blending tool on some of it, I am going to have to shade a little bit more here. You don't have to over blend. More blending does not mean it's better. You want some roughness and some texture. All right. Okay, so that's going pretty well. now that I've added some shading, I'm going to need to make sure I don't smudge that. So now I've got a piece of scrap paper. This is going to be my smudge proofing tool. All right, make sure that I don't have anything on the back. So I have some words on the back so I can rip that off. Doesn't matter really what I have on the front. Okay, so I can put this over what I was doing before. All right, so now I'm going to start to shade a little bit into the negative space. So remember down here at the bottom, I said I had a little bit of shadow. Now, within my shadow, it's not all equally shadowed. So right next to this edge, it's really, really dark, and then it's light, and then it gets a little bit darker. And then the table outside of the shadow, it's not a really precise line here, as a lot of edges of shadows are not, but it gets a little bit lighter again out here. All right, so I've already kind of created this really, really dark space. Then I'm going to have this lighten up. All right, so, and notice how having that little bit of lighter area helps make this edge of the box pop even more. So that very bottom edge of the box, and then on the table kind of, and that's that reflected light even within a shadow. So notice I'm actually making the edge of the box down here just a little bit darker. And one thing too, I want to make sure as I do this, I'm looking at the overall shape as well. And sometimes I notice, oops, something has gotten a little bit off, a little bit funky. Maybe my box has gotten longer over here and shorter over here, so I need to adjust. So you always want to keep looking at what you're doing. So if I need to, I can bring this down just a little bit. I'm actually adding as I shade to the bottom of the box. And so now, 2 inches, just about 2 inches. I can bring it down just a little bit more. So I want to make sure that that's really nice and consistent. Okay, and then again, I can go back to shading this little shadow out here. And then remember, that didn't have a really precise edge on it, so I'm going to keep going a little bit out here. All right, so that's where it goes from kind of that middle gray to that very light gray. Now, if I wanted to, I could keep shading kind of that entire area of the table below, but that might get a little bit heavy feeling and too dark feeling. So I can just kind of blend that out and let it get light. Okay, so I'm just going to blend that out to the white of the page. All right, so now I'm going to work on this shadow over here. All right, so again, at this edge, even though this is a shadow, we want this to be darker and this to be lighter, even though the space around here will then be even lighter. All right, so we want to be careful as we approach this edge. Okay, so I'm going to actually start at this bottom edge. All right, and notice I'm going to get very, very close to over here, but I don't want it to be dark along this edge at all. All right, so I'm almost using like a circular motion there. All right, but just tiny, tiny, tiny. Get right up to it, almost right up to it. But I don't want it to be really, really dark. So I'm just keeping that very, very light, and then I'm shading over here. So notice I'm actually using a lighter shading pencil now. And then along this edge, I don't need that to be really crisp. So I can actually even erase this edge. So I'm still shading out to about that same place. And notice I'm still just going at the same angle. Flattens out a little bit at the top. I could also go at a horizontal angle because this is just light on the table. So a horizontal angle, even if your shadow is steeper, will kind of reaffirm that the table itself is lying down flat. Okay, and notice out here, I don't need to have this be really, really precise. In fact, I don't really want it to be super precise because I want that edge to look like the edge of a shadow. And again, even though when I'm blending in here, I don't want to blend that edge. So I want to be really, really careful. Okay, and now again, to get this sort of secondary shadow, this almost ghost shadow, I'm going to shade that, but it can just be a little bit lighter. If they're the same, I'm not going to worry about it because I can just go back and make the first one a little bit darker along there. So I'm going back to where that first shadow's edge was, and if I want to make that stand out like it does in the photo, and I can just make that a little bit darker. But again, I don't have to keep all these edges super precise because they're shadows. I don't really want them necessarily to be super precise unless I've got very, very strong lighting. Okay, let's see. So now I'm going to deal with some of this top edge of the box. Okay, so one of the first things that I'm going to notice is that along this edge here between the table and the space directly above the table, that background space behind my table, it's pretty dark. All right, and then it gets lighter, it gets kind of like, say, a middle gray. All right, but I'm going to start there. So at that edge, I'm going to start by making this really, really dark along this edge. And I'm going to shade up from there. Okay, now here, I don't want to create too much confusion, so I'm going to use a gradation. I'm going to just let it get light as it approaches this edge. All right, it doesn't have to go to white, but it's going to get light. So this part here, where I can say this is actually darker than that, I want to make sure that is visibly darker in my drawing as well. All right, so I'm using here, it's the darkest, and I'm using a gradual change of value. So a gradation of value as I go up, but also as I get near the box, at least at that front plane. Now, back here at this top plane is light, and the space around it, although it's not super dark, in some places at least, it's darker than the box. And I'm going to kind of generalize that. because again, that rule that we've been talking about in general, areas that we want to appear to go back in space, we can make those a little bit darker. All right, so I'm going to now shade at the edge of my box and away from it. So here I was worried I didn't want to make this too dark because I didn't want it to compete in value with this dark part. Here, I want the box to be lighter because at least part of it is lighter in the photograph, and then in some of the other areas they're a very similar value. So I'm going to generalize a little bit. And here I actually want it to be darker. So notice I keep looking. I don't just assume that I know what's going to happen. I keep, in my photograph, I've zoomed in. If I were doing this with the real live setup in front of me, I would similarly be moving my eye, and I would be looking at my drawing, of course, but then I would keep looking up at the still life object in front of me. Okay. So now people often ask with this, how do I know how much to shade? There's not a precise answer, but we don't want this to look too artificial. So for now, I'm just going to keep kind of generally shading it. And I could shade the whole thing up to the very top of the page. So notice here, I'm following this contour line. So my shading can turn, but then I might want that to kind of coalesce with my other shading. So see how I'm using a curve there? And my mark making is so small that I really don't even see those slight variations in the directionality of the mark making. So I don't have to worry about them competing if I'm using kind of a curve and I'm using just really, really small marks. All right, so the tissue is changing in value, but even where it's darker here and lighter here, it's still all comparatively lighter to this space around it. All right, so I'm going to keep shading all around here. And again, with this, even this back edge of the box where they're very, very close in value, for the sake of making this, the box itself, appear to pop forward, I'm going to shade the area behind it just a little bit darker. And again, that's a trick, an artist trick that you can use. Now, if it were clear that the box itself were darker and the space behind it, say we're against a white wall, was lighter, then I would shade the thing that was in front. But because they're so close in value and I want to make the one in front appear to pop forward, I'm going to make the choice to shade the background darker. And again, because they're so close in value, you might see some areas in the photograph where maybe for a little tiny bit, the thing in front appears darker and then this space behind it actually appears lighter. And you could actually even draw that if you were really, really wanting to capture every detail. You could have them flip-flop. But in this case, that's such a small detail, and I don't really need to do that. But that frequently does come into play. So it's really just key to observe what's happening in real life, and a photograph is a really useful tool for kind of freezing reality and kind of being able to observe it even more closely than you may be used to doing with your naked eye. So you can train your naked eye, but before you've kind of reached that level. All right, so notice now when we're getting to this front edge of the box here, okay, I just want to pay attention because I'm going to get to this dark part. Okay, so here I don't want to make it too dark next to that. And in fact, if I look really, really closely, the edge of this little cardboard here is catching the light. So you often will see what appears to almost be, to almost be like a white edge between two dark spaces. So that's the edge of this catching the light. So I can use that right there. So see how I drew, I'm going to kind of blow that up for you. Okay. So I had this dark edge here. All right, and all I did was create a line there and shade on the other side. And now voila, I have a white line separating those two dark spaces. And again, I did need to make that very, very precise. So I switched to my pencil with the sharper point. All right, and now here, where I'm trying to go back and forth between, well, what's in front and what's in back, and I'm using gradations. And now I'm joining up this with that, and I just have that white edge left in between there, and just kind of disappears as this joins to that. And I can look at this to help guide that as well if I want to and I need to. So that's the real secret. If you're not sure, well, what do I do here? What's going on? Look back at your photograph and that'll give you the clue. Or better yet, look at the real thing in front of you really closely. It's all about relationships between forms. Okay, so again, now I'm back to this edge of the table. I'm shading up. And I'm starting to come to that question we were asking before of, well, what do I do with this space? Do I shade all the way to the top of the page? The thing I don't want is to have it look really, really artificial. So you can kind of experiment with how far do you want to shade. Now, if we were at school, we had those graphite sticks. We could even switch to that, although some people don't like the different kind of texture that gives them. This would also be a place where people might use the side of the pencil here. I think because I'm going to leave most of this table very light, I do want to balance that out by shading pretty far into this negative space. And if all of this looks very, very dark in your setup, you could shade this very, very dark. That's just going to vary. And notice if I kind of blurred this background, it would go from dark to middle to light as it moved up to the window. So that kind of works out. So I can kind of use that as a visual cue. Notice I don't want to go too fast. I am trying to go a little bit faster for this demo, but there's kind of a limit to that. I can't make my marks too long or they're going to start to get wonky. All right, so even now you can notice the difference, but if I'm planning to blend this anyway, notice I'm going to get close to these edges where I'm blending. but I'm not going to go over those edges. So out here where there are no lines, I can blend as much as I want. And notice too, if I'm in areas where I've been a little bit sloppier with the shading, I might not be able to blend it as much as I want. So I might have to go back and shade a little bit more precisely. Because I won't be able to smooth everything out with a blending tool. It's not magic. And this is one of the big secrets of artists. You know, it's not that they have like a magical power. It's just that when they observe closely, and when they see something that doesn't look right, they go back and fix it. They don't just say, oh, well, I didn't get it the first time. They figure out, you know, what can I do to make that better? And they might try a bunch of different things until they get what they want. Okay, and notice how to get this kind of blend from foreground to background along this edge and then into the background, I keep working at it. I might pump up this contrast a little bit more. But again, I didn't shade right up to this edge here where I want the front to be darker. All right, so it's looking pretty good. I'm gonna leave that alone for now, take a little break, and then it's almost done, as you can see. So I'm gonna finish up with details in the next video.